My name is Michał Trębacz. I'm head of the research department at the Polish Museum, so I will have the opportunity to introduce the panel and introduce the first speaker, hoping that our chair will turn in soon. And I'm sorry for the poor introduction, but I'm seeing that we have a lot of participants, listeners to this panel, so I hope it will work all out, but we cannot wait much longer. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you all on a panel on exhibiting loss, discovering new museum possibilities. And again, I'm very sorry for a poor introduction, but our first speaker will be Gabriele Kohlbauer-Fritz, who is representing Jewish Museum in Vienna. She's curator, collection manager there. And Gabriele, I'm sorry, but the virtual microphone is yours. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yes. Can Mark, good. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation for you on the search of lost time and space, Die Gute Stube by Isidor Kaufmann and Maya Sachs Shabbos Room. I think Jeffrey has already been in our house and has seen it. Yeah, can I have the first image, please? Next. Yeah. The first Jewish museum in Vienna was founded in 1896. It was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. It was a private museum, and responsible for it was the Society for the Collection and Preservation of Artistic and Historical Memorials of Judaism. The founding members of the society were all representatives of the Viennese educated middle class. The famous Viennese architect Wilhelm Stiassny, he was the first president of the society, and the actor Adolf Sonnenthal, and as well as the otologist Adam Politzer, they were elected vice presidents of the society, and the architect Max Fleischer was a secretary. So in the early years of its existence, the museum often changed its address from the first district to the second district in Vienna. The first district is the center of Vienna, and the second district is the center of Jewish Vienna, the Leopoldstadt. The last address of the Jewish Museum was at Malzgasse in the second district. And here we see an exhibition room of the museum from the early 20th century, probably at the Praterstrasse, where the museum was situated in an upper bourgeois apartment. And then the next image, please. Yes. One of the major attractions of the Jewish Museum Vienna was a Shabbat room installation, the so-called Parlor or Gute Stube in German. The room installation was designed by the well-known artist the Viennese artist Isidor Kaufmann. The first version of the Gute Stube was presented to the public in 1899. And in 1903, a postcard of the Gute Stube was published by the Society for the Collection and Preservation of Artistic and Historical Memorials of Judaism. You see here on the right-hand side, you see the postcard of the Gute Stube. Next, please. Yeah. There existed different versions of the Gute Stube. So Isidor Kaufmann, he adapted it very often, yeah. And the Russian doctor and ethnologist Samuel Weissenberg, who was in close contact with the Jewish Museum Vienna and who visited it in 1907, wrote about the Gute Stube, and I quote now his. The Gute Stube is a room in which a Jewish heart can really rest and take pleasure. One is overcome by a wistful feeling about the good old days that have gone forever. One is transported back to one's childhood, and one automatically looks around for one's grandparents to wish them good Shabbos. Maybe it was no coincidence that Kaufmann's Gute Stube was created in Freud's city, where even without a couch, the autosuggestive qualities gave assimilated and middle-class Jews often first or second generation immigrants, the possibility of looking back on their own childhood or the childhood of their parents, or giving the next generation an idea of this lost world. So, next, please. Isidor Kaufmann, he was also an acculturated Viennese Jew who in the first period of his artistic career painted Viennese genre scenes. In the second half of his life, he became interested in Jewish themes. Like the Belarusian writer and ethnographer Ansky, he set off on an expedition to the east in search of true Judaism. And armed with a sketchbook, Kaufmann traveled to the eastern provinces of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, to Bohemia, Moravia, and then to Galicia and the Bukovina. In his Viennese studio, he painted scenes of Eastern European Jewish piety, particularly Hasidism, as he imagined it to be. Kaufmann's work is part of the Jewish Renaissance movement at the turn of the 20th century. Like Buber in his Hasidic stories, Kaufmann erected an artistic monument to Hasidism that was both transfiguring and idealized. In establishing the Shabbat room, he was probably also inspired by other period or historical rooms that became popular in the last third of the 19th century, like the Rococo Stube at the Museum Carolino Augusteum in Salzburg, in Austria, or the Franz von Grillparzer apartment at the Historical Museum of the city of Vienna. Franz von Grillparzer was a famous Viennese author, and you have a period room, a Franz Grillparzer room in the Historical Museum of the city of Vienna. It's now the Wien Museum, where Matti Bunzl works as a director. And Kaufmann put together the interior of the Gute Stube in an eclectic way, using furniture that were also accessories in his paintings. And here you see you see a painting not by Isidor Kaufmann, but by Adolf Abeles. It's said to be a portrait of the Rushina Rabbi, the famous Rushina Rabbi of the Friedman dynasty. Whether it's really him or not, we cannot be absolutely sure. And on the left-hand side, hello Galit, you see a children's bed amulet, also from the collection of the Old Jewish Museum. Yeah, and these two objects have been preserved until they have survived, and they are still in in the collections of the Jewish Museum Vienna. Next image, please. Yeah, and here you see this wall reflector on the left-hand side, and you see it also in a painting by Isidor Kaufmann. On the right-hand side, you see one of his famous paintings, a Talmudic lesson, and you see the wall reflector on the wall. Yeah, and if you are familiar with Kaufmann's paintings, for example, there's a very famous painting which is in the Jewish Museum, New York now, Shabbat scene, and there also you have objects which have been in the Shabbat room in Vienna, and which Kaufmann used in his paintings. Next, please. Yeah, in 1911, the Shabbat room was shown at the International Hygiene Exhibition at Dresden, where the rabbi and ethnologist Max Grunwald organized the Jewish section, and where Jewish hygiene rules were presented from a scientific point of view. The Shabbat Stube, very much inspired by Kaufmann's Gute Stube, was put together by Jewish women organizations from Rhineland and Westphalia, and this Shabbat was presented from a hygiene perspective as a recreation period for a healthy body and mind, and as the center for Jewish family life. In comparison to Kaufmann's Gute Stube in Vienna, where the stage was a walk-in area, where the visitors could interact, in Dresden a cordon was placed in front of the entrance to the Shabbat room. You see the cordon on the postcard. Yeah, then next, please. And in the collections of the first Jewish museum, we have photographs of two other Shabbat installations at a charity event organized by a Jewish woman at the Dr. Krüger Orphanage in Vienna. The Dr. Krüger Orphanage was situated next to the Jewish Museum in the Malzgasse. And one on the right-hand side is more or less a copy of the Gute Stube at the Jewish Museum of Isidor Kaufmann's Gute Stube, and the other on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, it shows a fancy Shabbat table, how Shabbat could have been celebrated maybe in a palais at Ringstrasse. But in a certain sense, also the fancy Shabbat table is a false image, taking into consideration that in many Jewish Ringstrassen households, Shabbat was not celebrated anymore. You could rather find a Christmas tree there. So, next, please. Yeah, in here we have a Shabbat table from the old Jewish Museum at the Malzgasse, and on the right-hand side, you see the last curator and director of the Jewish Museum, Jakob Bronner. When the Nazis came to power and Austria became part of the German Reich, the Jewish Museum at the Malzgasse was immediately closed, and the inventory, including the objects of the Gute Stube, were confiscated. In August 1938, the last curator, Jakob Bronner, he had to write a typewritten inventory list of the museum's collections and pack the objects into boxes. He could flee to Palestine, and in 1939, the anthropologist Josef Wastel, he was director of the anthropological division of the Natural History Museum in Vienna. He displayed some of the objects of the Jewish Museum in a race science exhibition entitled "The Physical and Mental Appearance of Jews," and this exhibition was shown at the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. In 1940, most of the objects from the Jewish Museum were given to the Museum of Ethnography in Vienna, which was then a part of the Museum of Natural History. And they survived there. And in 1949, the collection of the former Jewish Museum, the collections were restituted to the Jewish community, the Kultusgemeinde in Vienna. Next slide, yes. And after the opening of the Jewish Museum of the city of Vienna, the curators began to compile an inventory of the collections. At least 1/3 of the objects from the old Jewish Museum are still missing. The furniture of the Gute Stube is lost, but 10 objects have survived. Today, these 10 objects can be seen at the Jewish Museum Vienna at the viewable storage area. You see here on the left-hand side, this monolithic block mounted on tracks that slide apart for working purposes, a plethora of Torah ornamentations, crowns, tassim, pointers, rimonim from Viennese and Austrian synagogues and prayer houses. Among those, precious silversmith works, but also mass-produced Judaica, ritual objects from private Jewish households are exhibited in a non-hierarchical way. All these pieces bear witness to the history of the year 1938, when Austrian synagogues were destroyed and burned down and Jewish property was confiscated. The only narrative are windows into the past. You see them on the slide, these white frames, which explain where the objects once have been. And one such window on the right-hand side opens a glimpse into the Gute Stube. Serving as an accessible museum archive, the depository represents the material memory of what was once Jewish Vienna. Next image, please. Yeah. At the invitation of our director, Daniel Sparrow, the Israeli artist Maya Sack designed a Shabbat room installation for the new permanent exhibition at the Jewish Museum Vienna. At first glance, her interest in lost European Jewish spaces recalls Kaufmann's search for the disappearing world of the shtetl in Eastern Europe. But there are many differences between the two artists. Maya Sack, who was born 30 years after the Shoah, in her work focuses on places in Europe that had been destroyed and whose original form exists only in memory. For the Shabbat installation at the Jewish Museum Vienna, she embarked on a dialogue with the curatorial staff of the museum, and she studied Kaufmann's work. She constructed a room with 4 walls. You see it here on the left-hand side. You can enter the room, and inside the room, she installed 4 computer-generated images of a virtual Shabbat room. You see here on the right-hand side, you can see the installation inside. Next image, please. Yeah. The first image shows the Gute Stube as it was at the last site of the old Jewish museum at Malzgasse. Integrated into the image is the showcase from the visible storage area with the surviving objects from the original room. You see it in the middle, in the center of the image. You see the showcase. And this first image combines in a relatively restrained way the 2 existences of Kaufmann's Gute Stube before and after the Shoah. Next, please. Yes, the second image is more dramatic and violent. It shows a collision between a Gute Stube version, probably the installation of the Gute Stube in the Praterstraße, installed by Kaufmann, and the Shabbat room installation at the Hygiene Museum in Dresden. Considering the fact that the Hygiene Museum in Dresden provided the basis for racial hygiene theories, the dramatical conflict in this image is obvious. Next, please. Yeah, the third image returns to Kaufmann's studio in Vienna. It shows, I mean, there exist no photographs of his studio. Nobody knows how his studio looked like. But it shows his studio full of objects and furniture, which he used for the installations of the Gute Stube and also for his paintings. And the next. The fourth and last image, named the Mystical Shabbat, reflects Kaufmann's installation in a spiritual sense. Here, the room in which Kaufmann offered the Jews of Vienna a platform for recalling their childhood in Eastern Europe becomes itself the protagonist of Shabbat. The light, you see that the light emanates from the table and not from the candles, not from the Shabbat candles. It's a diving light that appears and flows only during Shabbat. In the image named Mystical Shabbat, Maya Sack removes Kaufmann's Gute Stube from its time and history and shines a mystical light on it. Whereas in the previous 3 historical images, she refuses to present the proverbial calm before the storm, the years before the Shoah. In this sense, Maya Sack has managed to create a period room that includes the break caused by the Shoah and the destruction of the Gute Stube, which marked the start of the expulsion and murder of 200,000 Austrian Jews. Comparing the Gute Stube installation by Isidor Kaufmann and the Shabbat room installation by Maya Sack, they both created period rooms, whose interest in a specific historical period is less the end than the means or a byproduct. For all the dichotomy between immigration and integration, which is reflected in Kaufmann's Gute Stube, and expulsion and extermination, which is reflected in Maya Sack's installation, the Lost Period Room by Kaufmann and Maya Sack installation have something in common as a place of recollection and contemplation that is recreated every time that the visitor steps into it. Kaufmann's Gute Stube has been destroyed. You cannot enter it anymore. You can have a glimpse on some of the surviving objects of the Gute Stube at the visible storage area, and you can find an artistic mirror image of his Gute Stube in Maya Sack's installation. Thank you. Any questions?
I wonder whether I should start functioning when I finally got into the. Good morning from Chicago. Morning. And thank you for this beautiful paper, Gabriele. Thank you for inviting me to this session. I'm very pleased. I'll say some general words after all the three papers, the ones that I wanted to say in the beginning, but I had some technical difficulties. So our next, I guess somebody introduced Gabriele and told oral credentials. Thank you. I'll introduce now Dr. Diego Rothman, who is a senior lecturer, researcher, artist, and curator. His research focuses on performative practices as related to local historiography, Yiddish theater, contemporary art and folklore, and research creation projects. Since July 2019, he is the head of the Department of Theater Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I'll briefly mention some of his work: The Yiddish Stage as a Temporary Home, Jigen and Schumacher's Satirical Theater 1927-1980, which came out in March 2021. The Hebrew version was published already in 2017, and he was the recipient of the 2019 Shapiro Award for the Best Book in Israel Studies. In 2000, Diego founded with Lea Mawas the Salamanca Group, active in contemporary art, performance, and public art. They published the art periodical He'arat Shulaim, which was a very, I think it was one of the foundations of avant-garde art public exhibited in Jerusalem and in Israel in general. In 2009, they founded the Mamuta Art and Research Center, which is today based in Hansen House, the former hospital in Jerusalem, which is a center for research and production and presentation. And in 2012, they established the Museum of the Contemporary. I think the last term, the Museum of the Contemporary, will be a key in the paper that Diego now will present. Diego, please try to stay within the time frame so that we can have a discussion.
Shall we switch off the audio now? Yes.
Yes. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Galit, and thank you, Gabriele. I think there's a great connection between the papers. I would change it now, but I don't have that possibility. But I will come to some aspects that are extremely related to your talk. So in July 2015, Rachel Tzorfati, a senior curator at the Israel Museum, conducted a guided tour of the Judaica Core exhibition. A painted wooden sukkah from Bavaria dated to the 1840s caught my attention, both because the sukkah's beauty with its impressive painting of Jerusalem almost seamlessly melding the holy city's landscape with that of the pastoral Bavarian village of Fischach, and because of the sukkah's biography. In 1937, 100 years after its construction in Nazis-controlled Germany, the sukkah was moved from the attic of the Deller's house in Fischach to Berta Frenkel's house in Munich. Frenkel, who fled Germany with her 5 children to Palestine, where she was reunited with her husband, smuggled the sukkah out in one of her lifts. She did so at the request of a close relative, Dr. Heinrich Feuchtwanger, a collector of Judaica and a dentist, who had convinced the Dellers to donate their sukkah to the Bezalel National Museum, which had opened in Palestine in 1922. My partner and colleague, Lea Mawas, and I were both fascinated by the story of the sukkah, which has been dismantled, disguised as lumber in order to hide the painted side, smuggled out of Germany, relocated in Palestine, and reassembled again in order to perform not anymore as a setting of a ritual practice, but as an ethnographic object, at the Bezalel National Museum since 1948 and since 1965 at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The process of disguising the sukkah as raw material, smuggling it out, translocating it to Jerusalem, and recontextualizing and canonizing it in a national museum in Jerusalem resonates strongly with the project we started a year earlier. Leah and I, together with Itamar Mendes-Flor and Yeshayahu Rabinovich, acquired the structure from the Jahalin Bedouin tribe in Khan al-Ahmar, dismantled it, smuggled it out from the West Bank as construction waste, reassembled it initially as a sukkah in the Hansen House garden in Jerusalem, or as a Bedouin shack disguised as a Jewish sukkah, only to be dismantled and later reassembled a second time as a work of art and ethnographic object at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Half of the amount of the payment went to the members of the Jahalin tribe, who initiated with this income an ecotourism project in a new structure built in the place of the former one. The other half was paid to the art center. Leah and I became excited about the possibility to smuggle the Deller Sukkah out of the Israel Museum, at least symbolically, and installing it at the Museum of the Contemporary at the Hansen House. The Museum of the Contemporary is a conceptual and portable institution we have created in 2012, and I will not be able to introduce it in detail. Sorry, Galit. In the frame of this paper, I will share some reflections on fragments of this long-term artistic research and ongoing project, which through the construction of a replica of a specific Jewish object and its wandering, attempt to reflect on the dramaturgical path of memory, restaging history, and wandering themes. About Sukkot, maybe I will not talk, maybe yes. The festival of Sukkot commemorates the exodus from Egypt by means of the commandment to build Sukkot, temporary structures the Israelites erected in the desert, topped by a covering of branches, making a roof that should be open to the sky. According to the commandment, Jews have to live in booths for 7 days. The Sukkah, ritually inhabited as an alternative home during the festival of Sukkot, intuitively qualifies, as argued by Galit Hassan Rokem, as the home of the wandering Jew. Hassan Rokem continues, like the wandering Jew, the Sukkah exists in a cyclical rather than a linear dimension of time. Like him, the Sukkah is a highly adaptive phenomenon. Like a husband who spontaneously knows the language of every place that he visits, the Sukkah emerges in style and materials from the diverse natural environments where Jews have lived and lived. The inside walls of the Deller Sukkah are painted with original paintings of the local Jewish street and Fishach landscape and with freestyle reproduction of the works of others. The main wall shows a painting of Jerusalem based on a lithograph by the German geographer Joseph Schwarz from 1836. The vignettes depicting the Jewish yearly cycle were based on engraving by Joseph Schwarz, printed in 1826 in the Sulzburg zone. The painting on the right wall represents both sides of the Judenhof. The first house on the right is the Deller house, with its garden and Esther Deller in the front house, where the Sukkah was erected every year. Other notable buildings are the synagogue and what was apparently the Jewish school. The wall on the left depicts Fishach Forest and a house, and the last shows two men, the local baron and his hunter, or perhaps Abraham Deller with his son or servant, going hunting with the dog. That was the Deller scenography for the yearly festival of Sukkot till the 1930s. Since the 1960s, the Deller Sukkah was reproduced in pictures, sometimes as an icon representing the Jewish diaspora's longing for Jerusalem, as other times showing the central role the Jewish community played in Fishach's development, and many times as a valuable piece of Jewish material culture. But I found the role played by the Deller Sukkah and its reproduction as part of the heritage of three families, the Dellers, Frenkels, and Feuchtwangers, to be of the greatest interest. The Deller Sukkah, said Rafi Stern, a Deller relative, and I quote, was an important fact of unity for our family. Every year, we waited for the holiday of Sukkot to see the picture of the Deller Sukkah hanging inside our own sukkahs and learn more about our family. As we grew up, we continued to keep the family history alive and told the children and nieces about the Sukkah and how it traveled to Jerusalem and showed them the Sukkah in its place of honor at the Israel Museum. Nomi Feuchtwanger-Sarig, the granddaughter of Heinrich Feuchtwanger, a historian, stated that the Sukkah is part of our DNA from birth. Ruchama Frenkel, granddaughter of Berta Frenkel, said, "We have a personal attachment to the Deir Sukkah, which came to Palestine in our family's lift and became part of our own heritage. As children, we were brought to the Israel Museum to see the Sukkah that our grandmother brought to the land of Israel. Besides those visits, 20 years ago, a picture of the Deir Sukkah appeared in a decorated calendar. Our father removed the picture and had it framed. Since then, he hung the picture in the family Sukkah. Some years ago, when we dismantled our parents' house, we duplicated the picture, and since then, each of us had a picture of the Deir Sukkah in their Sukkah." So a tradition developed in tandem in two families, in different families, in which a picture of a sukkah hangs on the wall of a sukkah. The actual sukkah becomes a backdrop for displaying another sukkah, perhaps a type of home museum, displaying paintings representing objects of longing and belonging, including both a personal and a collective heritage. The act of remembrance of the days of wandering the desert during the Jewish exodus and the remembrance of the days of the Jewish diaspora in Germany are represented or practiced through these Misanabim. In the winter of 2017, Lea and I invited Niri Halom and Ktura Manor to join us in the project of building and painting an unauthorized but accurate replica of the Deller's family's painted wooden sukkah. Without permits, we photographed the original sukkah at the museum and began our research into it, documenting the entire performative process in video. We had to adjust the construction to the quality of the local wood and to the budget we had, creating a local type of a barbarian sukkah. We constructed it with low-quality lumber. We covered the roof with palm branches from the Hansen House garden. The sukkah was resized to allow it to be installed indoors in the room devoted to it, resulting in a sukkah 20% smaller than the original. During the creative process, Lea and I found ourselves suddenly longing for a place we had never been before and were in no way attached to. We decided to visit Fischach to see what remained of the painted landscape. We wanted to enter the painting. In February 2017, we started a reverse pilgrimage. We and our children traveled to Fischach on a roots trip of a family we never heard of before. We came to realize that many buildings in the painting still remain in Fischach: the Deller House, the synagogue, and perhaps the Jewish school. The absence of Jews was extremely present. We therefore abandoned the idea of a faithful replica, or we understood it differently. We decided to intervene in the replica slightly. The walls of the synagogue in the new sukkah feature two graffiti inscriptions in pencil: a Magen David that shows that the current dental clinic was once a synagogue, a copy of the sign installed by the director and owner of the clinic, Dr. Dominic Spinder's name, and a copy of the sign in front of the building attesting to the actual function of the former synagogue as a dentist clinic. Instead of the figure of Esther Deller pictured in front of the Deller house, there is a graffiti with the names of the families living there when we visited: the Gross family and the Osder family. Standing in front of the Deller house in Fischach, the most surprising fact for us was the presence of the monumental village church, which was missing in the background of the original sukkah. We debated the issue to bring the church back or leave it absent in the reproduction until a week before the opening, when we invited Rachel Tzorfati to visit the new Deller sukkah. Tzorfati was extremely surprised to find the replica. We revealed her our discovery about the church, and she answered that she already knew that. During the restoration process done in 2000, a explained the restorers discovered that the church was indeed painted in the sukkah, but was later erased by another generation of the Deller family, or perhaps by the owners of the sukkah themselves after seeing the church painted for the first time. With this new detail in mind, we decided to bring back the church based on the pictures Tzorfati sent to us from the restoration process. On one hand, the replica became an updated version of the Deller Sukkah, and on the other hand, the replica became closer to the original than the original itself. The history, the landscape of the Deller Sukkah was being transformed or repaired along the years. In early 2000, while comparing the actual Deller Sukkah on display with pictures from the Sukkah exhibited at Bezalel National Museum, Israel Museum curators realized that there were large repainted areas covering the Sukkah paintings. Having showed the Deller Sukkah in a subverted version for since its opening, the curators initiated a restorative work. In 2009, the Sukkah made its way to the Atelier Régional de Restauration in France. The repainting was done in the early 1960s, apparently in Germany, where the Sukkah was sent to be part of the exhibition Monumenta Judaica, 2,000 Years of History and Culture of the Jews in the Rhine country, held in Köln in 1963-1964. The exhibition in Germany was suspected of being responsible for the anonymous and unauthorized repaintings, but this is still unclear. The process of restoration and the politics of preservation were now negotiated between the restorers and the Israel Museum curators. In discussing which layers were going to be restored or erased, they were actually deciding on the story the object would perform, tell, and preserve. Tzorfati explained that she decided to bring the Sukkah back to the state it was when it was received at the Bezalel National Museum. Because the church had apparently been erased in a previous period, Tzorfati decided not to repaint it. And I quote, "The moment an object arrives at the museum," explained Rachel Tzorfati, "its life necessarily stops, and we have to preserve the object the way we got it." And so forth. Thus, the restoration becomes a type of official death certificates for an object that, thanks to the anonymous makeover, lived and performed an altered afterlife for more than 40 years. Although the new Sukkah may finally look identical to the original, it would have opposite meanings. The paintings on the walls of the Sukkah would be subtly transform the depicted environment. The image of Jerusalem on one of the walls, which in the original was an object of yearning, would become, being painted in Jerusalem, a kind of proprietary statement. The scenes of the pastoral German village, which used to provide a kind of visual record of the original local landscape, would become a wistful memorial of a community and a time that no longer exists. The new Sukkah, or the artists, were yearning for exile or yearning for the possibility of finding Jerusalem in another place. The Deller family painted a hybrid landscape expressing their dual feelings of longing and belonging to Jerusalem and Fischach. The new Sukkah inverted those references of longing and belonging, added the raised church, and made the contemporary Jewish absence present. This parallel and alternative visual historiography, it was not painted on the top of the previous layers of painting, but on a different canvas, avoiding the palimpsest effect and promoting a polyphonic visual representation of Jewish Fischach historiography and a reflection, literally, on contemporary ethnography, historical performativity, and museological display. In August 2018, Leah and I started what we thought might be a long period of being out of our second homeland, Jerusalem. We moved with our two kids from a small rented apartment in the intense neighborhood of Musrara in Jerusalem into a 1960s bungalows with a very big backyard adjacent to a golf course in a beautiful and calm bourgeois Canadian neighborhood. We have rented the Soberman's house, the only furnished house we have found available in Kingston, Ontario. When both Soberman's parents passed away, their children had put their family home where they grew up for long-term rental assist with a 1960s decor, the Soberman's book on the shelves, the piano in the salon, a big art collection that included more than 40 paintings, mostly reproductions of well-known artworks, some originals works by non-canonical artists. For a year, we lived in their house. We slept in their sheets and ate with their service. We found ourselves living in a set of another family. It was unexpectedly an unplanned stay at a local version of the House Museum of the Contemporary. I have time, Galit, 3 to 4 minutes?
4 minutes.
Okay. In our 4 trips to discover the town, we found a branch of Home Depot and an amazing section for treated lumber. We didn't think it twice. We decided to build a new sukkah in the backyard of our rented house. The structure would be a replica of the structure of the Derer sukkah. The size, we realized when building it, was not exactly the same size. The proportions were miscalculated in the translation from centimeters into inches. The walls of the sukkah remained for the holiday decorated with some bird toys bought at a Dollarama branch and some other paraphernalia produced by our daughter and a friend of hers. Not having had enough time to paint the walls as we expected, the walls remained bare. According to the traditions, Jews are expected to live in the sukkah for 7 days, dismantling it with the end of the holidays. But we left the sukkah in the backyard of the Soberman house for the whole year of our residency in Canada. So the symbology of the holiday itself were challenged or stretched, as well as the function of the object. A month before our coming back to Israel, we commissioned the local artist, Brian Ohad, to register our Canadian winter staying, painting a translated version of the painting of the Deller Sukkah. Instead of the Deller house, the Soberman house. Instead of Jerusalem as a site of longing, the frozen Ontario Lake. Instead of the Bavarian landscape, the snowy golf course with our happy kids. The Kingston Sukkah was smuggled out from Canada as a gazebo and installed as an art object in the Museum of the Contemporary in Jerusalem in the frame of the permanent residency exhibition, together with a documentary film about our stay and a free reconstruction of the Soberman Salon, including the replicas of their paintings, commissioned this time to Adi Karim and Shahar Carmel. I don't have the time to enter into details about this project. Installation, in a way, was not only telling our own story of wandering, but a story of migration, of ideas, home, reproduction, and ways to represent loss through temporary presence. The reproduction of the Soberman's house was dismantled at the end of the permanent residency exhibit. The replica of the Deller Sukkah that was installed for 4 years as part of the permanent exhibition of the Museum of the Contemporary was dismantled a week before Sukkot for a coming show at the Ramat Gan Art Museum. In its place, we installed, after cutting the size of the lumbers, correcting the mistranslation, the Kingston Sukkah. We were supposed to spend this winter in Canada, but didn't get our visas yet, and we'll probably keep longing to the frozen Ontario Lake. Thank you very much.
Are there any direct questions to Diego's paper? I'll devote 3 minutes to that before we let Jeff talk, and then we'll leave 10 minutes, I hope, at the end for a general discussion. Okay, I'm introducing Jeffrey Chandler, who is a distinguished professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University. His books are many, and they include While America Watches, Televising the Holocaust, 1999, Adventures in Yiddish Land, Post-Vernacular Language and Culture, 2005, Jews, God and Videotape, Religion and Media in America, 2009, Shtetl, A Vernacular Intellectual History, 2014, and his last, almost not last, I hope, but his most recent book is Yiddish, Biography of a Language, 2020. He's currently a research fellow at the Center for Jewish History in New York. And I should say his research interests are wide, and they encompass Jewish memory practices, Jewish cultural history, intellectual history of Jewish studies, digital humanities in Jewish studies, Yiddish language, literature, and nature. And there's much more to say, but we'll now listen to Jeffrey's talk on YIVO's Lost Museum of the Homes of the Past, please. Unmute, please.
Okay, now you can hear me, yes? Okay, sorry about that, I forgot. Okay, so thank you, Galit, and I want to thank Gabriele and Diego for such wonderful papers, and I hope that this will add to our conversation. What I'm presenting is very much work in progress. In fact, this is the first time I'll have talked about this research in progress anywhere. So here goes. By 1943, it had become devastatingly clear that Europe's Jews were succumbing to persecution of an unprecedented magnitude, culminating in the slaughter of millions at the hands of Germany and its collaborators. Jews in the United States despaired at the fate of European Jewry and at their own inability, as the largest Jewish community outside of Europe, to stanch the relentless killing. The crisis was especially acute for those Jews who had only recently arrived in America from Europe. They had left behind their family, friends, colleagues, and communities with whom they had lived and worked, and to whom many hoped they would soon return. Among these newcomers to the United States were a small number of scholars who had devoted their professional lives to the study of Eastern Europe's Yiddish-speaking Jews at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which had been founded in Vilna in 1925. These scholars were now located in New York City, where YIVO had established an American branch the same year that the Institute was founded. But shortly after the start of World War II, this American branch was designated as YIVO's provisional headquarters. Some of these recently arrived scholars hoped to return to Vilna after the war and resume their work at the Institute there. But by 1943, they were faced with the overwhelming knowledge that doing so was no longer viable. In response, they sought some way to address their profound sense of loss, to memorialize those lives, places, and ways of living that were being destroyed, and to continue their work as scholars of this culture, albeit under radically different circumstances. To do this, YIVO scholars made a remarkable decision. They would create a museum to be called the Museum die Alte Heimen, the Museum of the Homes of the Past. This was, in effect, an effort to create a museum from scratch. At the time, YIVO lacked exhibit materials and had limited financial resources. It had no museum professionals on its staff or space for the proposed museum. YIVO's vision for the museum was unprecedented and daunting in its scope, a comprehensive presentation of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And yet, the Institute was uncertain of who would constitute the project's supporters or its audience. In January 1944, YIVO announced plans for this museum at the Institute's annual conference and informed the public of the project in the American Yiddish press. The proposed museum would be of value to all American Jews, YIVO stated, but particularly those who had come to the United States from Eastern Europe. Moreover, it would have special importance for American-born Jewish youth unfamiliar with the world in which their parents or grandparents had been raised. The museum, YIVO argued, would strengthen the bonds among these generations by educating younger Americans about their East European heritage. YIVO made a targeted appeal for support of this project to Landsmannschaften, that is the immigrant hometown mutual aid societies, as well as other immigrant aid and social organizations, as their members had maintained strong ties to their former homes in Europe. This appeal served two purposes. First, members of these organizations comprised a key audience for the proposed museum, and they would be more likely to bring their children or grandchildren to view the exhibition. Second, YIVO knew that these organizations had the kind of materials that it sought for the exhibitions and hoped to encourage their members to donate them to the Institute. Doing so, Ivo argued, would also guarantee that these materials would not fall victim to eventual neglect, loss, or destruction, but would be safeguarded in perpetuity. The configuration of Landsmannschaften resonated with Ivo's conceptualization of the museum. Just as each of these organizations maintained ties to a particular town or city, Ivo envisioned the museum's exhibitions to be arranged geographically, that is, various items from a particular locale would be grouped together. In this regard, Ivo's museum would break with the precedent of most Jewish museums and exhibitions of the pre-war era. Their displays were typically arranged according to similar groups of objects, such as ceremonial objects for synagogue, then ceremonial objects for the home, often arranged by holiday or life cycle event, then manuscripts, portraits, coins, and medals, and so on. Moreover, Ivo cast a wider net in its list of collecting desiderata. Objects used in traditional Jewish life, whether for holidays or for every day, and items of customary clothing appear on the list. It begins with photographs, which could include outdoor appearance of cities and towns, of groups or organizations, of families and individuals, of traditional practices, holiday weddings, celebrations, etc. In addition, Ivo sought a variety of written materials, letters, memoirs, folklore materials. These were less likely to be displayed, but rather to be archived as resources for the Institute's researchers. This collecting effort also echoed Ivo's extensive efforts before the war to exhort Jews in Eastern Europe to gather ethnographic materials for the Institute scholars in Vilna. To gather both materials and support for the museum project, Ivo invited representatives of Landsmannschaften and similar organizations to a conference in March of 1944. That same month, a Ivo board member discussed the museum project during a broadcast on WEVD, the most popular radio station that aired Yiddish language programming in New York City. He exhorted the need to collect material from American Jews as an urgent response to the destruction of East European Jewry. The museum can become a major, important undertaking, he explained, only if it includes as many Jewish settlements in Eastern Europe as possible. To our deepest pain and sorrow, we can no longer receive any materials from there. There, Jewish life is drowning in blood. The museum can be built only with the things that are found in America. We must build the museum quickly. Now, we cannot waste a minute, so that the objects that may be found in America will not, God forbid, be lost. He concludes the broadcast by proclaiming the museum as an essential vehicle for the future of Jewish life, both in America and Europe.
Jeffrey, sorry to interrupt. Galit, yes? Can you please mute your microphone because there is a sound interruption. Only one person can have a microphone on. Can you mute your microphone because the audience cannot hear? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I'll continue. All right. He concludes the broadcast by proclaiming the museum as an essential vehicle for the future of Jewish life in both America and Europe. He states, the war will end with a victory by the Allied nations. Jewish life will start to be rebuilt in Europe. For them, those rescued from the destruction in Europe, and for us here in America, for their children and for our own, let us create an image of Jewish generations so that we can find in that image the strength, faith, power, and stubborn will to build further our Jewish life and build it better and more beautifully. In subsequent months, Ivo also approached the directors of local secular Yiddish high schools, asking them to involve their students in the collecting project. In addition to helping Ivo create the museum, the Institute argued this collecting effort could provide an opportunity to teach students about the East European Jewish past. By August 1946, Ivo had amassed a considerable amount of material, especially more than 600 photographs. However, Ivo's staff noted that people were often reluctant to part with items, especially objects. The Institute's argument that donating materials to the museum would help create an institution of value to the Jewish people collectively, and would also preserve these items for posterity, did not prevail over strong personal attachments to objects that materialize lost people, places, and ways of life. Ivo's plan for a museum of the homes of the past was never realized. It seems to have been abandoned by 1947. I've yet to find an explicit explanation for not creating the museum, but a number of possibilities emerge as the Institute addressed other concerns following the end of the war. Chief among these was the recovery of many of the books, documents, and other materials that German forces had confiscated from the Vilna Yivo. These items were eventually sent to the Institute in New York, along with other items that once belonged to Vilna's Jewish community. Yivo also turns its attention to a new area of scholarship, including what would eventually be called Holocaust studies, and began publishing some of the first works in this field. As part of this undertaking, Yivo started an appeal in 1945 to collect materials that document Jewish life in Europe under Nazi occupation. The Institute organized one of the first public exhibitions on this subject to be shown in the United States, presented in its New York headquarters in 1946. Though it was an unrealized project, Yivo's Museum of the Homes of the Past marks a threshold moment in the history of efforts to memorialize the lives of East European Jews destroyed during the Holocaust. Indeed, ideas that had been developed for this project anticipated future memorial works, both by Yivo and by others, in the immediate post-war years, as well as decades after. For example, in 1947, the publishers of the Jewish Daily Forward, the most widely read Yiddish newspaper in America, issued a book titled Die verschwundene Welt, The Vanished World. This album of 350 photographs of pre-war East European Jewish life both mourned the Holocaust millions of victims and commemorated Eastern Europe as having been, in its words, the religious and spiritual hegemony of world Jewry for 5 centuries. Like Yivo's plan for its museum, the album's rubric for organizing these images is primarily geographic, beginning with a section titled Jewish Cities, which is arranged by country, starting with Poland. Some of the photographs in the volume are credited as coming from Yivo's holdings. And among those who consulted on the creation of the book is Moshe Kligsberg, who had served as secretary for Yivo's Museums of the Home of the Past. One of the most elaborately conceived scholarly efforts to collect information on the pre-war lives of East European Jews is the Language and Cultural Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry, initiated by linguist Uriel Weinreich at Columbia University in the late 1950s. Working with responses from over 600 native informants to an extensive questionnaire, the atlas maps regional variations in Yiddish language and folkways across the European continent. These variations range from phonological, lexical, and grammatical differences in dialect to an array of folkloric beliefs and practices. Like the Museum of the Homes of the Past, the atlas roots Yiddish speakers in the physical geography of Europe, in which language and culture articulate a set of boundaries, territories, and causeways different from the modern political map of Eastern Europe. Generation after the end of World War II, Yivo undertook 2 projects that, in a sense, fulfilled the ambitions of the Institute's planned Museum of the Homes of the Past, along with a parallel desire to create an archive devoted to the Jewish past in Eastern Europe. In 1976, the Institute mounted a major exhibition of photographs of Jewish life in Poland from the mid-19th century to the eve of World War II. Titled Image Before My Eyes, the exhibition was followed by a book of the same title, issued in 1977, and a documentary film, which premiered in 1981. This project drew on Yivo's extensive photo archive, which includes pictures that had been collected for the Museum of the Homes of the Past. However, the approach to the topic in Image Before My Eyes was different from the proposed museum display of the 1940s. Image focused only on Poland and exclusively on photography, which was treated as a subject of interest in its own right. Thus, the book begins with a discussion of the history of photography of and by Jews in Poland, from the first photographers' studios, which opened in the 1850s, to the work of professional photojournalists, such as Alter Kaczyzna and Roman Vishniak, in the 1920s and 30s. In the years 1979 to 1981, NIVO renewed its efforts to acquire the documents of Landsmannschaften for its archives, which resulted in a published guide to this collection of hundreds of organizations' records in 1986. Though it had proved difficult for Landsmannschaften to part with these materials during the mid-1940s, by the late 1970s, these organizations' circumstances had changed. They were no longer concerned with the immediate challenge of rescuing survivors of the Holocaust and mourning the destruction of the communities that had nurtured their members before they had come to America. Instead, Landsmannschaften had entered the final phase of their role in immigrant life, serving primarily as burial societies for an aging membership. So to conclude, at first glance, one might regard the Museum of the Homes of the Past as simply a lost opportunity. But in light of these post-war developments, it might be better viewed as marking an inflection point in the dynamics of representing Jewish Eastern Europe, and especially as a prescient effort to begin grappling with how to remember the lives that Jews had once led in Eastern Europe before their destruction, an effort that continues to pose challenges in Holocaust memory practices to this day. Thank you.
Galit, please unmute now. Galit, please turn your microphone on. You need to press the red icon with the microphone and it should turn green.
Okay. Do you hear me now? Can you also see me? I don't hear anybody else. Okay, I tried.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Okay.
You can. I don't know if I can hear others, but that's a different thing. I apologize for misusing this very new platform I've never used before, and I won't use much time for my comment. I'll rather listen to questions and discussion. But I want to say we had 3 really great papers. Thank you, Jeffrey, for that very important paper, I think. And I'm happy you are going on with the project. We heard 3 papers about the moment of loss turned into an exploration or explorations of new forms of representations. We had 3 different fields, so to say, different disciplines. We had artistic practice from 3 continents, America, Europe, Asia. They all relate to the violent interruption of the life of Jews in Europe, East and West Europe, with the violent destruction of the Shoah. We had Gabriele's magnificent representation of museal practices then and now. We had Diego's fruitful combination of art and scholarship from a performance studies approach. And we have Jeffrey's historian's perspective on a possibility of a museum that never actually materialized. I would just say that in addition to the highlighting of the crucial difference of Jewish visual production between the period before and after Shoah, we can also discern some general tensions between, let's say, on the epistemological performance level of demonstration, representation, creation, and interpretation that prevailed through all 3 papers. On the existential and maybe ontological level, we can talk about the death and life of objects, which appeared again in all 3 papers, about second lives, about rebirth, And this level of discussion almost brings us to some kind of a transcendental perspective that I'll refrain from at now. Then we have the cognitive aspect of forgetting and remembering, which was very strongly stressed in Jeffrey's paper that we heard now. So we have these three papers which seem to be very different, but actually speak the same language and